the Jan Söderberg Family Prize in Economics and Management and the Prize Lecture. The prize is 1 million Swedish for outstanding and groundbreaking research, and together with this day, the result of a generous donation from the Jan and Åsa Söderberg family to the Lund University School of Economics and Management. The prize is awarded to a prominent researcher under the age of 50. The person has made significant contributions to research in the field of economics and management. According to statutes, the recipient of the prize is elected through a nominations process at LUSEM. Rest assured, all full and associate professors at the school received multiple invitations to nominate candidates this past fall. Most of the prize money is intended to support the recipient's research, primarily to enable him or her to involve and engage younger researchers in project activities. But there is also a part of the prize for the recipient to use as he or she pleases. This year, the prize goes to Professor Linus Dahlander. But before I introduce the man of the hour, and we'll listen to his interesting talk, I would like to give the floor to the man behind the idea, Jan Söderberg.
Thank you, Maria. Well, I have not prepared my speech in English, so I will take it in Swedish. Hej och hjärtligt välkomna. Nu är det snart dags att dela ut min familjs pris i ekonomi för 2022. Det är härligt att äntligen kunna ses. Förra året genomförde vi evenemanget digitalt och det var bra. Men det finns inget som slår att få möta kloka, engagerade, inspirerade studenter, forskare och goda vänner i verkliga livet. Allt sedan 1991, då vi flyttade till Lund, har vi med glädje följt de stora målmedvetna steg Ekonomihögskolan har tagit för att parkera sig bland de främsta internationella affärsskolorna. Jag tackar skolan för att man huserar detta pris och allt engagemang vi i familjen fått för att genomföra priset och Ekonomidagarna. Vårt mål med Ekonomidagen, det var att slå hål på myten om att ekonomi är svårt och bara handlar om kost-, intäktsanalys, redovisning eller finansanalys. Till saken hör att jag körde på alla tentorna när jag gjorde de här. Men vi ville att det på ett enkelt och begripligt sätt skulle komma fram hur viktig del ekonomi är i de stora samhällsfrågorna. Marianne Bertrand tog 2019 upp viktiga frågor i sin prisföreläsning, såsom ojämlikheter, diskriminering, sexism, och 2020 visade Nathan Nanos på hur viktiga makroekonomiska frågor som till exempel bistånd påverkar u-ländernas ekonomi och utveckling. Temat för årets ekonomidag och pris är företagande och entreprenörskap. Vilket känns extra roligt eftersom årets pristagares forskning handlar om just de här frågorna. Juryn har tagit fasta på dina inspirerande och spännande och innovativa bidrag till forskningen. Redan första året som priset utdelades var ditt namn uppe som en av de heta kandidaterna och det kändes extra kul att vi nu kan få stötta denna forskning. Linus Dahlanders forskning ger åtminstone mig en tankeställare då han talar om innovationsprocesser som något som spänner över företagets gränser och baseras på samarbeten och kunskapsspridning. Något som utmanar många konventionella sanningar om hur affärer och företagande utvecklas. Framförallt för en gammal silverräv som mig själv. Jag och förhoppningsvis många med mig ser med stort intresse fram emot din kommande föreläsning, Linus. The Future of Open Innovation. Föreläsningen kommer säkert att göra oss lite mer insiktsfulla om framtiden. Så lycka till med din fortsatta forskning. Tack.
Du stannar. So, thank you, Jan. Now, let me introduce Linus Dahlander a little bit more detailed to you. Yes, he is Swedish, born in Kalmar in 1979. Academically, a Gothenburg product from Handelshögskolan at GU and Chalmers. But since his graduation, he's had an international career for long. Linus Dahlander is currently a professor at the European School of Management and Technology in Berlin and holds the Lufthansa Group Share in Innovation. The motivation from the committee was that Linus Dahlander's research spans a wide field linked to innovation and entrepreneurship, with a special focus on how ideas develop into innovations across companies and networks. Linus Dahlander has published important studies on collaboration between organizations, focusing on companies and industries under technological transformation. And thus, he has studied new concepts such as open innovation, crowdsourcing, and user communities linked to the new economy. The committee also noted that the varied perspectives and methods used in Professor Dahlander's study make him cross borders, not only conceptually, but also methodologically. He includes more established approaches in studies of entrepreneurship and innovation to those of field experiments that are more common in economics, that allow to get at mechanisms at work and allow for more causal interpretation of results. For me, as Deputy Dean at LUSEM, I am very happy to say that Professor Dahlander's research is exciting and relevant, in line with our ambitions, and complements, connects, as well as inspires ongoing research at the school. And like the cabin personnel at any airline, I say, we look forward to seeing you again soon. I am therefore very happy to present you, Linus, as the third recipient of the Jan Söderberg Prize in Economics and Management. But before you come up here and get the diploma, I want you to listen to this.
Hi, good afternoon, Sweden, and warmest congratulations to you, Linus. I'm Marianne Bertrand. I'm professor of economics at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago, and I was very lucky to be the first recipient of the Jan Söderberg Family Prize in Economics and Management. I am so excited to hear that finally you guys have been able to get in person again back in Lund. Warmest congratulations again to you, Linus. All the best going forward. And again, my deep thanks to the Jan Söderberg family for the generous support of my work and research. Have a great afternoon. Bye, guys.
Good afternoon, Lund, and congratulations to you, Linus Dahlander. My name is Nathan Nunn, and I'm a professor of economics at Harvard University. I'm also the previous recipient of the Jan Söderberg Family Prize in Economics and Management. However, unfortunately, due to the pandemic, I never had the opportunity to visit Lund in person. So I'd just like to wish you the very best, Linus, and I really hope you enjoy your stay. And to the Söderberg family and to Lund University School of Economics and Management, I'm still hoping that we'll be able to meet in person someday in the near future. But until then, I just want to wish you all the very best from Cambridge, Massachusetts.
So please accept the prize.
Tack så mycket. Ja, tack så jättemycket. Ja, okej. Ja, kanske.
Ska vi ta det där också? Du får det sen.
Tack så jättemycket. Ja, men ni får tillbaks dem.
The floor is yours.
Ja, är ni redo där bak? Sorry, are you ready in the back? I'm confused with the languages. I just said this before we began that I was once hosting a delegation in Berlin, a bunch of Swedes coming in. And after speaking for them for 2 hours, I was commended on my good level of Swedish, which is my mother tongue. So I'm happy that I can do this presentation in English. So I'm Linus. I have a very long title, but my son actually usually describes me as a dude with a very long title, and I think there's some truth to it as well. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of some of the research that I've done, and I'm going to bring in some snippet of my research to give like a flair of some of the research that I've done, and then hopefully we can have an ongoing discussion about this afterwards as well. So what I'm going to present to you is this idea about open innovation. And I will begin with some of the facts that we know and some of the intellectual lineages that went into this and some of the observations from the early work on this as well. And I think this is one of these graphs that I use for my students and for my MBA students, but I kind of like it because I think it's obviously a bit simplistic, but it gives at least an indication for how you can think about innovation. So think about on the y-axis, the interaction between the participants, on the other axis, over time. And we talked about Edison before, and I think many of you are economic historians. You know this about Edison, that he was indeed actually involved in the lab. He had lots of collaborators. He was inspired, if not stealing ideas from Tesla and the like. But I think most of the data that we have actually suggests that back in the day, if you had a great idea, it was almost enough for you to actually bring this to the market. I think between the First and the Second World War, many of these, like when we talk about research and development, so R&D, many of these labs actually came together with the intention that all of a sudden, like the innovation process became too complex, so a single person was unable to actually innovate. And therefore, you needed to bring people together, co-locate them, finding ways for them to work up in different kinds of teams to come up with ideas that could be brought to market. And I think in the last 30 or so years, if you look at formal agreements like alliances, joint ventures, different kinds of acquisitions with the intention to innovate more, has actually skyrocketed in the last 30 years. And I think it goes much deeper than this, that it's not only about like the formal kinds of agreements, it's also something about like the handshake agreements between scientists, between managers, working in different kinds of organizations. And the question, of course, is then, how can you then harness this more distributed model of innovation? So let's, before we go into this, travel to Austria for a few seconds. And obviously, why I have the Austrian flag is that we're going to talk just very briefly about where some of these ideas actually came from. And Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize, talked about this, that knowledge is incredibly distributed in society. And he has this quote that practically every individual has some advantage over all others because he possesses unique information of which beneficial use might be made. So Hayek was probably one of the first, if not the first, to sort of observe that, look, knowledge is incredibly widely distributed in society. It spans different kinds of organizations. And if you're a manager working inside an organization, it obviously begs the question then that how can we collaborate with others? Are we going to form a formal agreement? Are we going to trust them to make like a handshake agreement? Can we find ways to bring them into our own innovation process with the intention to innovate more? And anyone recognizing this guy? It's hard, but it's supposed to be hard in the afternoon to keep you awake. And this is Sal Palmisano, who was the former president and CEO. And I'm going to talk about one of the IBM studies that we did in a second. And I like this quote that he talks about this, like, look, pretty much echoing what Hayek said, that it's no longer individuals toiling in a laboratory. It's not an individual, it's individuals, it's multidisciplinary, it's global, and it's collaborative. And obviously, this sounds great, right? But obviously, it also comes with a bunch of challenges. So if we had a lawyer here before, how are we going to incentivize people to collaborate with outside? What are some of the intellectual property issues that actually arise in this particular kind of process? So it's not completely trivial for how to actually organize this. And Hank Chesbrough and others, they have provided different kinds of definitions for this. So how can you think about open innovation? And it talks about this, and this sounds academic, but I'll explain in a second what it actually means. That open innovation is a paradigm that firms can and should use to essentially work with both external and internal ideas and internal and external pathways to market. Sounds super academic, right? But imagine an innovation process. We know that if you work with like 100 ideas, how many of the 100 ideas inside an organization are brought to market? Do you have any wide guesses? Say again? Something like that, like between 0 and 5% perhaps, like depending on how good you organize and what you mean with an idea as well. But essentially what this suggests, right, is that maybe some of the best ideas are not originating inside your organization, but you'll find them outside of the boundaries of the firm. So your job as a manager is to detect those great ideas, bring them inside the organization, infuse that with your local expertise and bring it to the market. And also, the other part about the internal and external pathways to market suggests that many of the things that we develop, if it is the case that we have 95% failures of the ideas that we work on internally, it could be that someone else would actually be better equipped to commercialize the idea. And there are quite a few, and I have a couple of examples of this, of organizations that have been good in developing ideas. They put them in the shelf inside the organization. They think about them as like almost having like Rembrandts in the attic, like great ideas somewhere. Maybe one day is going to come where we can actually commercialize this idea. And it turns out that usually don't. Okay, so what are some of the drivers of openness if we think about this logically? And the argument that I'm going to make is pretty uncontroversial. You're all going to think like, I know this, right? This is simple. But I think the conclusion from this is essentially echoing the point that knowledge, resources, and talent are distributed in society. Think about the first one of mobility of workers. My parents' generation, most people worked for the same employer for maybe not 2 years like my students do, but they work for like 10 years, 20 years. If they're ever so lucky, they get a golden watch. I've been at ESMT for 10 years, and probably some people think I'm crazy for being with the same employer for so long. But I think most of the young kids that are presenting their amazing ideas outside are probably going to work for the same employer for a short period of time. Also, undoubtedly, like globalization, right? Some of the things that I've been studying where ideas are originating around the world, you think that they're all going to come from the local place, like Germany, where I'm located, but in reality, they're coming from all corners of the world, like more than 100 different kinds of countries. I'm also old enough to have observed the emergence of internet, right? Like now we take it for granted. We go into our cell phones and connect. You find a way to go back to the hotel or find a way here. I remember the sound the first time I connected to the internet, like, you remember the sound? And I think it sort of echoes the point that, look, there are new things that we can do because we can connect to people around the world that allows us to do things that we were unable to do in the past. Okay, and also I think a more cynical description is that there's also this thing about financial resources that all organizations are having more pressure on the bottom line. So obviously, if you can be more productive and get more ideas, more innovations brought to market for the euros that you invest, then obviously this is something that's going to work to your advantage. All of these things were pretty uncontroversial, right? And there are couple of implications of this. First is that now it's easier to collaborate because some of the frictions of finding partners that are working in Ghana or working in Australia, it's easier to collaborate. You can find different ways to connect to those people. That allows you to have more potential number of partners. And also, if you have an idea and if you want to go out to actually conquer the world, this is something that we can do today to a much greater extent than we could in the past. And one implication of this is that almost independently of who you are, that means that you cannot have everything that you need inside your organization to actually be able to innovate. Because talent, knowledge, and resources are widely distributed in society. So it obviously begs this question then, if talent, knowledge, and resources are distributed in society, how can we find ways to rope those people in? Or conversely, connect to them if there's something about the ideas that we develop internally that could be better commercialized by someone else. So many of you have heard this, but this is oftentimes encapsulated in this idea that no matter who you are, most of the smartest people work for someone else. And I think there's so much truth to it, right? And I like this because a couple of years back, I had the good fortune when I was at Imperial to work on a project with David Gann and Siobhan on finding out like how IBM and some of the people in an organization that have hundreds of thousands of employees are actually bringing in ideas inside the organization. So IBM, I think we can jump over this, have about 350,000 employees. About half of them have scientific or technical degrees, super strong tradition in technological leadership. They invest so deeply into research and development every year. And I think for 21 consecutive years, they have been the most active patenter in United States Patent and Trademark Organization. So obviously, this is an organization with 350,000 employees who should have the muscles in terms of the brains inside the organization to do everything internally, right? But in reality, what they do with this particular organization is that they place different kinds of people, they task them with the work of finding great ideas that can be brought inside the organization. And one of the things that they did in this particular case is that we know this from other kind of research, is that they incorporated a separate but equal career ladder. So typically when you think about progression and being a leader, right? You work as a manager, you become a middle manager, and you become a CEO. And what IBM and many of these larger organizations have noticed is that some people who are like a geek like myself, they don't necessarily want to become a leader at the university or a leader within IBM. They would like to become more task over collective work. They would like to have more tasks about working with finding out new ideas. And what's cool about these experts is that they often have autonomy to go outside, find good ideas that they can then bring inside the organization. And we did, like, I'm going to jump over like the technical details behind this, but we essentially asked them, like, what are your sources of innovative ideas, and what are the kinds of people that you go after? So this just gives you like a proportion. And for universities, it's somewhat good news. I think like 73% of those people who had the autonomy to go outside, hunt for new ideas, and integrate them, 73% of them actually went to universities. Pretty much all of them talked to customers and users. And what we were interested in is that, is it good for a person to have more diversity, not in terms of like the number of people that you know, but the different kinds of people? And essentially what we find is that the more you collaborate and you talk to different kinds of people, so you get more variance in the network that you potentially build up, then you are going to become much more innovative inside IBM. You're going to find better ideas. You're going to be more successful to implement them afterwards. But this comes with like a huge caveat. So this is essentially telling you, like, if you have no diversity whatsoever, so this is only talking to people at universities. These people are not going to be super innovative, as you can see on the low end, and innovation is on this particular axis. And if we jump over to all the way here, can you see this in the back, Anna? This is if you have essentially have the utmost diversity. So you talk to people from public research institutes, you talk to customers, you talk to universities, and so forth. And one of the interesting things that we found about this particular study is that everyone talked about, like, look, you should go out and talk to many different kinds of people. But it became sort of a short implication because many of these people turned into like social butterflies, like connecting on LinkedIn to people, trying to expand their network at like an enormous thing. And essentially what our study showed was that, look, expanding this kind of network, making sure that you have different kinds of partners is going to require you to spend like an enormous amount of attention and very intense time commitment. And the ones that were the most innovative among these people were the ones that had a super diverse network, but also allocated an enormous amount of time to this. And we can also show that there are an enormous amount of inefficiencies inside the organizations where most people actually underappreciate this dimension. So they think that, look, I'm going to build my network, I'm going to go out, find people, but in reality, that's actually not something that they did. Okay, so what's open innovation? That's just an indication now that, look, knowledge is widely distributed in society. What is it then? And I think the best way to think about this is to contrast it with a super closed innovation model to bring some more clarity to what it means. And imagine here that you have the 100 companies here in the beginning, right? That's the research projects, the great ideas that your employee generates. And your big task as a manager is to think about, like, look, we're going to evaluate the idea. If it passes certain kinds of criteria, we're going to continue to invest in it. You get some more time, and over time, we're going to funnel down on the most important ideas, and hopefully, you are going to be successful in the ideas that you bring to market. In reality, though, we know this is fraught with many different kinds of problems. One problem is that organizations, even the ones that we think about as the most innovative, are oftentimes investing in projects. They go through the long process of bringing it to market only to turn out that, look, there was no market for it, right? This became a huge failure once it actually hits the market. What's also more, and actually I have some recent research with numbers on this as well, and this is perhaps even more disturbing, right? That you have the opportunity, the people inside your organization have the potential, they come up with great ideas. There's something where there is a market for this thing. You can do it, but you actually actively decide against it. So that's like Vinnova having the opportunity to work with Klarna before, or something like this. Like they have this amazing opportunity. They have this to actually collaborate with them. Okay, Vinnova had a different interest. Sorry to insult you, but that's the point, right? That you have an opportunity to collaborate, to work with this one, and you actually kill it. And lots of examples of this where organizations struggle with this potential thing. I think this is kind of funny that if you look at organizations that have these R&D labs, it goes back a long time to Chris Freeman, who often talks about R&D labs are a bit like castles on a hill. And if you look at their images, like sometimes they even have water around the R&D lab. And this is another one that looks like a nuclear facility of some kind, but it's actually an R&D lab. And an open innovation funnel, you have the same kinds of issues, right? Like not all ideas are going to come from the outside. You're going to continue to work with things that are coming up, popping up from smart people inside the organization. You as a manager or a person inside this company are still going to make a tough decision, like we're going to continue to invest in it. But in addition to this, there are ideas that maybe you find out that there is like an amazing startup in Lund. Let's buy this one, integrate it, bring our own technical expertise and bring it to the market. Or conversely, which oftentimes do not happen, is that, look, we developed this thing, we have this amazing idea of a new potential drug or molecule that could potentially cure a disease, but it's not in line with the kinds of customers that we're going after. So let's be active in trying to find someone else who would be suitable to commercialize this one. And I think one of the points about this is that when we think about innovation and some of the early work that I did on this is that oftentimes when we think about this, we have a huge tendency to think about formal kinds of agreements because it's easy and fun, perhaps as a researcher, to sit there with your databases and count the number of alliances or joint ventures or something like this. But I think the dirty secret about this is that much of these like formal interactions when it comes to thinking about an innovation process is really like studying like the tip of the iceberg. In reality, when you think about an innovation process, behind every kind of alliance that you count, behind every joint venture agreement, there are tons of these handshake agreements or more informal modes of actually collaborating with people on the outside. And much of the things that I've been interested in are much more on the what's under the surface or the hidden part of the iceberg. Okay, so I work at a business school, and one of the things that you're taught to do is to do 2x2s. So here's my attempt for doing a 2x2. And one of the sad things that it's actually my most cited paper, so it tells you something about that it actually works. So if you think about innovation, there is this idea of getting ideas from the outside, so bringing them in, so that's inbound. There's something about having things that originated inside and bring them out, that's outbound. And I think the important thing about the iceberg argument is that we have a huge tendency to think about those kinds of formal kinds of agreements, or like for money, where you actually collaborate in formal kinds of alliances or formal kinds of joint ventures, when in reality, much of the innovation process also captures this thing of having more non-pecuniary kinds of interactions. And if you think about this way, obviously you can think about this as one way of being open is about acquiring things on the outside, from the outside environment, bring them in. Another thing could be selling or licensing out to the outside. I have many stories here. Large pharmaceutical companies are notoriously bad at this, where they have thousands and thousands of R&D scientists generating lots of potential compounds that could have a difference in the market, but they only have like one or a half person who actually goes out and try to find a commercialization partner for those things that they don't bring to market. And the things that I've been personally more interested in is this idea of like, how can you informally source and absorb ideas that originate on the outside? How can you organize for this as an organization to get good ideas that can be brought inside? And then there's always the one where there's someone like, this doesn't make any sense, because I once took a strategy class and I've been taught to never reveal the things that I'm working on. And revealing is about like voluntarily disclosing or forfeiting control of internal resources to the outside. Can you think of any examples of big companies that are currently doing this? Anyone? Anna? We had not synchronized this before, but it just tells you this example is always coming up. So Tesla, what they do, and they're obviously not doing this for the goodness of their hearts, right? They do this to push the direction of everyone around them. They are advancing the battery technology in the hope that they are disproportionately going to be in good position to actually benefit from this particular one. They can start to set standard. They are one organization that is extremely well equipped to actually benefit from this one. Other examples of this that are much more done in chemistry, pharmaceuticals, and biotech is that if you want to make life difficult for your competitors, you should reveal it and put it in the public domain, because then our friends, the lawyers, are going to say like, look, I found this in a suspicious journal somewhere that it was actually published. You are not inventing something new. It's already out there, and you can make life incredibly difficult for your competitors. So let me give you some examples of the hidden part of the iceberg of some of the stuff that I've done. And Henning, one of my friends are working on many different kinds of projects. We're also converting it to, this was the joke that I had before, by the way, that sometimes like the academic journals have a readership of 3. Your mom, yourself, your mom, and your dad. But now my parents are here, so obviously they're not reading my paper, so you only have a readership of 1, right? And I've tried to also convert them into something that people can also read afterwards, like these HBR stuff. And what about crowdsourcing? I think this is kind of interesting. Like crowdsourcing is like one mechanism for how you can scale this to a large extent, get ideas from the outside, and potentially come up with good opportunities of things that you can do inside the organization. So we have all the examples from ID Storm, like Dell. If there are any Italians in the room, I'm going to insult you and calling this coffee. If there are any other Germans, I know there's at least one, I'm going to insult you and call this beer, where Budweiser is introducing new crowdsourced beer. And I think many organizations are playing around with this. How can we harness the creativity of people who are undefined to us, unknown to us, and bring them inside the organization? Another great example, if you haven't seen this one, you're going to have a long list of recommendations of stuff to see on Netflix, is Diagnosis. Is there anyone who's seen this? You're in for a treat. So Diagnosis is this doctor. So she's a medical doctor, I believe, at Yale, and she writes a column for New York Times. And Diagnosis is about her attempt to help patients that have reached the knowledge frontier of what medical doctors can essentially do. And so there are a number of patients that have been going through trying to talk to all the experts in the US, trying to figure out what's wrong with me. I have these issues, it cannot be explained, we've ruled out everything else, we've done all the tests that we can potentially do, and no one can figure out a solution to what's actually going on with me. So what she does is, through the help of New York Times, she crowdsources these stories to people around the world. And the remarkable thing about them is that in a couple of cases, which I almost think is enough in itself, they are actually coming up to precise treatments that the patients can do. And in other kinds of situations, to the very least, actually find people who have similar kinds of issues. There's one story about a very rare disease that one of the kids have, where there's another kid actually across a bridge in Copenhagen that they can put their parents, combine them, and obviously they can allow for these parents to also talk about the issues that they face. Okay, and then there's like some skeptic, this is not rocket science, so let me give you a rocket science example. What is this? This is one of these pictures of NASA of what prevents us from colonizing Mars. And you ask yourself, why should we move to Mars? I do too. But I think it's kind of fun to think about these issues. So NASA, obviously, they have rocket scientists. They have smart people working inside the organization. And they identified, I believe it's 11 different kinds of scientific problems that needs to be solved in order for us one day in the future, when I'm too old, to colonize Mars. And what they did is that, look, no one inside the organization can come up with solutions to this particular problem, so let's reach out to the crowd and for issues such as space radiation, which remains a major hazard for humans going to Mars. And the pretty remarkable thing about this is that out of the 10 or 11 challenges that they faced, I think 3 or 4 of them are actually solved by using crowds from people around the world. And the solution to this particular one, or one of the solutions, came from an undergraduate at MIT who at the age of 19, which is kind of funny, right? Like came up with a very different way of thinking about the problem. And also sort of underscoring this point of globalization and more connected markets, many of the people who actually had proposed solutions and were among the winners were also coming from very different places than the US. Obviously, this can go wrong as well. Like if you don't think about how to organize this, how to actually structure the crowdsourcing, it can lead to these particular kinds of challenges. So this is kind of fun, right? So here they reach out to the crowd, let's come up with amazing names for our new polar research vessel. And in this particular case, the organizers didn't think about how are we going to organize this? Are we going to make the voting anonymous and so forth? And the one that raised to the top was Boaty McBoatface. And the fourth one is actually my favorite, it's bloody cold here. I think it was actually David Attenborough that they went against the crowd for a good reason in this particular case. I think it's bloody cold here. It's a great name on a boat. And to illustrate some of the work that we've done in this area, I have this study of that I've done with Henning, where we study the implementation of crowdsourcing across tens of thousands of organizations that reach out to the crowd to get new ideas for different kinds of products and services that they can do. We collaborate with this company, we get fed the data, and we can study what kinds of ideas that they implement, what are some of the challenges that they face, and so forth. And to give sort of the takeaways away from this particular work that we've done, is that when you talk to these organizations, so why do you do this in the first place? They all say, we want to have great, creative, novel ideas that we haven't done in the past. But then we start to measure, like, okay, so what are the ideas that they are exposed to, and which ones do they actually select? And it turns out that they're actually choosing ideas that are very close to them in terms of both the content, so they've done very similar things in the past. They're also very structurally distant, so they had very similar supporters in the past, and they also collaborated with these people. So essentially, like they say that they would like to have novel ideas, and what happens in this particular case is that they've done this stuff that they've always done. So we had this idea that we can also show that like once you are exposed to many different more alternatives, you also become even more stereotypical in the kinds of decisions that you make. Another study, which I think is more like ongoing and kind of fun, you all know about Lego, right? How many of you know about Lego ideas? Have you done a set for, Olof, have you done a set for Lego ideas? Next time. So Lego Ideas, this is an attempt that originally came from a partnership with a Japanese company, and they realized that this potential idea had a huge potential. And I think the interesting thing to study about them is that you can start asking questions about like how should you work with outside, but I think there are much more deeper lessons from this particular study as well. And you can see here that people are proposing ideas. You can see the number of comments, the number of supporters, the number of days left. You can get information about the person. We get this data fed every week to do different kinds of projects that we're working on. And what happens in this particular case is that people then submit a Lego set. If you can accumulate 100 supporters in 60 days, then you're lucky, because then you get even more time. So then you can accumulate up to 1,000 supporters, 5,000 supporters, and some of them, and this is incredibly rare, get 10,000 supporters. And what happens in this particular case is that Lego then moves in, they go in, and they have very fun criteria. Is this something that we can do? Is it playable? So is it like fun to play around with? And some of these ideas, even if you accumulated 10,000 votes, actually get downright rejected by the firm. You can imagine this, right? Like all of a sudden, like all of you were super excited about Maria's idea that she came up with. Everyone is supporting it. And all of a sudden, like Lego moves in and say, no, this is a bad idea. We're never going to do it. And one of the things, and I think it goes into this discussion about like also like how do we fund science and other things that we do. So this is like a machine learning project that we've been working on with lots of different new kinds of methods about image recognition, not only about text recognition. But the things that we want to predict is that once there is like a new idea popping up, so or a new grant proposed to a grant agency or something like this, or a new startup pitch, can we, from the inception of this particular idea, determine that this is going to be like the next big thing? And it turns out that, and we can show this pretty convincingly now, that we are extremely good in filtering out the bad ideas. We would not filter out Klarna like Vinnova did. We would keep them in the consideration set. But essentially, if you pass the minimum quality threshold, so like you filter out the bad ideas, then it's pretty much all random, right? Like then it's incredibly difficult to predict what's going to be the next big thing. And another thing that we've done is that I thought was like, it's more like a twist to this, like once you have this enormous community dimension, many of the reactions of the community can also go astray. So we also studied what happens to all those people that are strong supporters of an idea. Do they get upset when your idea that you worked on, you supported this one for years, right? And all of a sudden Lego says that this doesn't have playability. How does it affect the people surrounding them? And what we can show is that these people who support an idea, they're not leaving the platform, which is good news for this particular company, but they get extremely negative. So they comment a lot more, they use extremely negative words, they write nasty things, but gladly enough, for the company, I guess, they only do this for about 2 weeks, and then they're settled down and they're happier again. Yeah. Are you ready? So I think there are also obviously like a number of problems, and I don't pretend that we have all the solutions to this. I think there are a couple of problems that are important to note about open innovation as well. And a number of issues that we know more generally, and not only from my own research, is this idea of like not invented here syndrome, different kinds of cognitive biases when it comes to especially like valuing the things that you've done to the extent that you hold on to them so much when in reality there could be better organizations out there that could commercialize them. I think there are also like sometimes some solutions, sometimes it's describing like a fire in a nuclear plant and offering like a blanket on the nuclear plant, but there are at least some solutions that I think point in this direction. And I think one of the lessons that we learned from working on open innovation is that many organizations have incentive systems in place that are almost working against their attempts to being open. So people get rewarded for generating ideas and actually bringing them and coming up with new creative things rather than actually implementing them and bring them to the next step of the development process. And I think if you work openly and trying to get ideas from the outside, rewarding people differently becomes incredibly important as a result. Obviously, there are also these things, right, that if you collaborate more with people on the outside, it also requires you to have different kinds of skills of working with outsiders. It's not only about your incentive system. And I think the IBM study sort of points to this direction where you have to have ways of being able to get good ideas from the outside, have networks in place where you can get the creative spark, but also being able to integrate those ideas and implement them. Because obviously, the open innovation part is also bringing the idea to market. It's not only about like generating new ideas. Sadly, some of the things, the recommendations that are out that I think actually works is like training versus hiring people. I think many organizations that have been very devoted to work like this realize that when you have a legacy problem, you have an organization in place, sometimes it's just easier to do this in a separate unit and have this separate from the rest of the organization because much of the work that they do is so detached from the rest of the organization. Herbert Simon and others noted this like a long time ago that what information do is that it creates like a poverty of attention, right? It consumes attention, and oftentimes this is the case, that if you work on the outside, you have your internal local colleagues, but in addition to this, you may get exposed to like crowdsourcing initiatives, new kinds of ideas, and that can essentially requires an enormous amount of attention. And I think the IBM example is one example of this where you have to devote some roles to search and change the reward structures to cope with these issues. You can jump this. Okay, so now we'll speculate a bit, like how do we go forward from here? I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers, but I have some ideas in the end of things that we observed after the pandemic. I think also now with the war in Ukraine, that sort of points in this particular direction about what happens during a crisis and what are some of the lessons that you can learn from this when it comes to actually organize innovation. So this, obviously, if you think about wicked problems, and many people talked about this before, take something as like plastics in the ocean, like big problem. When you think about Adidas and the Parley kinds of initiatives or something like this, I don't pretend that open innovation can solve all of these different kinds of issues. But when you have a wicked problem, and from the perspective of the organization, from the perspective of the manager or even the entrepreneur, collaborating in some way externally, putting some of the other kinds of issues that you have to the side, and collaborate across organizations becomes incredibly important if you are to cope with some of these issues. And I think during the crisis, you've seen this, right? That during pandemic, this became super obvious. I think Martin and I, who have been working with, in the beginning, we tried to document this in like March 2020. Like, obviously, here's like a new virus. This is something that we haven't done before. Organizations realized, look, we need a quick solution to this particular kind of problem. We know this from other kinds of literature that, look, there is a crisis out there. It causes organizations to explore more. So explore more in the sense of being able to do things that stand against what they've done in the past. If this is the case, what happens then is that, look, we need a quick solution to this one. We're willing to try things that we haven't done in the past. And a thing that we also saw during the pandemic, once it comes to some of these odd collaborations like Ford, Siemens, and so forth, is that the role of IP changes as well. And I think it changes in the regard of like, let's not think about how we're going to split the rewards and signing up the exact details in the contract. Let's solve the problem first, and then we think about how we're actually going to divide the rewards afterwards. And I think another thing that we've seen now during the pandemic is that some of the most creative solutions, and there are some databases on this even online, some of the most unexpected solutions and some of the most creative solutions actually came from the equivalent of the suit guy high-fiving the punk rocker, like really odd collaborations, companies that have not partnered in the past that came together to solve an issue at a very high pace. And obviously, there are a number of issues with this. If it is the case that we've seen more exploration, companies partnering to a greater extent, then you have to ask yourself, how lasting are these collaborations, right? Is it something that we just do to solve the particular kinds of issues that came up in the pandemic, or is it something that is also going to take like a foothold after the pandemic as well? And I think another really important thing is like, are the lessons that we learned actually extrapolated to the future? And I think you can also take a cynical take on this as well, if there are any cynical people in the room, that will the crisis cause companies to adopt an open innovation rhetoric to impose R&D cuts as well? Like, look, now we say that we're going to collaborate with people on the outside, we're going to work more with people on the outside, and we're not going to use this as like a complement to internal R&D. We're actually going to substitute some of the internal things. I also have some interesting observations that I actually think like the literature is not keeping up to par with. And I think like the managers are struggling with issues where we have pretty poor explanations and poor recommendations for how to organize this. I had the examples of like Apple and Google of generating much more data than is actually being used. I used Apple and Google because it's like companies that you know. But I think if you take almost any company that is in production in Sweden at the moment, many of them are using machines, different kinds of detection of trying to generate tons of data. And obviously, one of the biggest challenges of this is that a large chunk of everything that is being created is just put on the servers or stored somewhere without actually being used into create events afterwards. And if you take this saying about like the information creates like a poverty of attention, obviously, if we have limited use, sometimes we also create new kinds of problems when it actually comes to synthesize this into something new afterwards. Another thing that is interesting, this is something that I'm too old to actually sort of realize, but all of my students, they think about application programming interfaces. So like obviously like open data that is out there. And what this allows you to do, so for example, like open banking, where you can combine different kinds of records, creates an enormous amount of opportunities for organizations to collect data across different kinds of organizations. And this is cool because you can develop something at a crazy pace. There are some companies that are thinking about this incredibly strategic, take Salesforce or something like this. But obviously, as we know from the story with Cambridge Analytica, it can also create pretty devastating externalities in terms of data breaches, abuse privacy, and also in terms of like anti-competitive behavior. And I think like some of these dark sides when it comes to the information age, we're actually not very good in giving good recommendations for how to organize this as a company. One thing that the Lego project also points in this direction is this idea of, obviously, with automated decision making. So if it is the case that you're generating things on the outside, you do this at a very quick pace, can you use artificial intelligence, different kinds of machine learning, to sift through the external options to reduce the selection burden on the organization? And I think the Lego project that we had actually points in this direction. Like, look, we're good in detecting bad ideas, but we cannot pick the winners, right? So think for a grant agency, like we can allow the people that sit on a committee to focus their attention on the ones that have the most importance for them, rather than going through like a long slew of list of bad projects. And one thing that is obviously like a negative aspect, if you are to use this to find like the best thing in the world, is that obviously machine learning is trained on historical data, so it becomes incredibly difficult to detect something that is like the next big thing as well. So I think it's more suitable right now to find bad ideas and allowing humans to actually choose between the ideas that are past the limited quality threshold. This is also something that's sort of like somewhat, I think, is an empirical observation where there's very limited work as well. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but there's like a huge thing in the software movement, and I think it goes beyond this as well, of organizations that have worked extremely openly, had a huge community dimension in allowing people to collaborate, And what happens at the moment is that some of these extremely large companies moves in to do acquisition of these companies. And I think there's some early work by other people who actually point in the direction that it has like a huge effect on the kinds of people that contribute to them. But I think it can also, in the long run, open up other kinds of opportunities for organizations that protect their ideas from the acquisition of larger companies to move in. So how do we address all this? I don't know. I have some ideas. I think sometimes when I read like management research, I get deeply disturbed because like I'm a management researcher and I don't understand the actual words in the paper itself. I think there's something to be said about actually grounding the literature into like real recent phenomena and not trying to develop like a super grand theory, but actually staying true to the stuff that we study that have potential, and also trying to find these anomalies, so finding things that don't square precisely with the things that we've done in the past. And I think it's our obligation as well to find interesting things that cannot be explained by existing theory, coming up with like a way of structure them, helping other people, not only managers, but the society at large, to think about these kinds of issues. The final thing, I think, is this idea of new methods and collaborations. An irony of the kind of research that I do is that it works in smaller teams. We talk about being open, but I think historically we've been extremely bad in turning our own lessons on ourselves. I don't know if there are many academics here, obviously, but if you read the recent paper by Millikan et al. In Nature, fascinating paper of things that we can do in management or even in economics where this is done to a greater extent. And what they do in this particular paper is that we know that a huge problem is that people have a hard time committing to long-term goals. So they generate potential kinds of solutions to this problem. They come up with, I think, 50 different kinds of ways to get people to commit to long-term goals. And the long-term goals in this particular case is going to the gym. And then they collaborate with a big gym chain. They design 50 or 51 interventions. They ask people, like, how effective do you think they are? So the econ people, they come up with incentives. The social psychologists, they come up with like social comparison. The management people come up with something soft. I'm a management person as well. But they come up with a bunch of things. And essentially what they illustrate afterwards is that many of these things that we think have like a huge effect on behavior actually has very, very limited effect. And I think this is something that I could never do alone. Even us as a group would have a hard time doing it alone. I think it requires collaborations across universities. On that note, I wanted to thank you so much for your attention. I'm honored by Jan and Åsa and Maria and the whole Lund community for the opportunity to present. I was nervous to present in front of my parents and everyone. I hope to stay in touch, and thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
So we all got something to think about and talk about. Thank you, Linus. One or two quick questions from the audience. I know it's been a long day, but anyone with a quick pitch? I think everyone's digesting.
I stand between you and a break. I can repeat the question, it's fine. So the question is, have you looked into how you can internally organize to work with open innovation? I mean, I've done some work in terms of like how you should incentivize people, but I think like, again, like, look, I'm here, but I'm also working with lots of other people, and the people that I work with lots of other people. And I think there are some recommendations for how to do this. I'm happy to share information that I have as well. Yeah, that was a short answer, knowing that I stand between you and a break.
So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And just 2 more minutes. I would like to thank all of you who came to Lund, participated through the day. I would like to thank Sara Sterner, who took us through the day. And I would like to very much thank everyone who made this possible before and during this day. Anna Brattström and colleagues for the program, Stefan Dahlin and Pia Silverstolpe from Stiftelsen Partnerskapet, the communication officers Louise Larsson and Malin Åkerskog, and last but not least, Daniel and Jonas, who made it be light and loud. Have a good rest of the day.